You wouldn't believe what happened that evening. The sun was setting over a quiet parking lot when John Carter adjusted his rearview mirror, his gaze flicking to the doors of the grocery store. His wife, Alyssa, had just popped in to grab a few things for dinner, and he was content waiting, flipping through emails on his phone. It was a routine Saturday night. Until it wasn't. The flashing red and blue lights behind his car shattered the stillness, and John's fingers instinctively tightened around the steering wheel. A police cruiser had pulled up, and the officer was stepping out, hand lingering near his holster. John's heart thudded faster. Something was wrong. "Evening, officer," John greeted, his voice calm as he lowered the window halfway. The officer, whose name tag read J. Miller, didn't respond in kind. His steely gaze cut right through John, sizing him up in a way that felt far too familiar. "What are you doing here?" he barked. John inhaled deeply, steadying himself. "Waiting for my wife. She's inside," he said evenly, nodding towards the store. "Is there a problem?" "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Miller demanded, his hand inching closer to his holster. The command was cold, almost hostile. John knew the type. He had encountered it more times than he cared to remember. John hesitated. He'd done nothing wrong. But he could feel the charge in the air, thick and buzzing with danger. This wasn't about suspicious activity or checking on a parked car. It was about something far uglier. No one could have predicted how quickly things would spiral. John kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, trying to remain calm, though the officer's demeanor was starting to unravel the peace he'd felt just moments before. "I'm just waiting for my wife, officer," John repeated, his voice steady, but there was a hint of steel to it now. "I haven't done anything wrong. There's no reason for me to get out of the car." The officer, Jake Miller, didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge the words John said. Instead, his gaze drifted to the back seat of the car, scanning the interior with an intensity that felt invasive. A few seconds passed, then the officer's lips twisted into a tight line. "I said, step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his voice rising now, filled with frustration. John's pulse quickened. He knew better than to argue. He had seen this kind of escalation before. A sudden refusal could mean more trouble than it was worth. But there was something different about this moment. The officer's eyes, narrowed with suspicion, spoke volumes. John exhaled, preparing himself for what was next. Slowly, he reached for the door handle, making sure his movements were deliberate and non-threatening. He didn't want to give Miller any reason to act on impulse. As soon as he cracked the door open, Miller was on him. The officer grabbed John's arm, jerking him roughly out of the car and twisting it behind his back with unnecessary force. "Turn around," Miller ordered, his voice sharp, almost a growl. John gritted his teeth as his body was slammed against the side of the car. The pressure on his arm was painful, but it was the humiliation, the way Miller treated him like a criminal without reason, that stung the most. "Officer, this isn't necessary," John said, his voice strained but firm. "I'm not resisting. You're making a mistake." But Miller didn't care. His breath was heavy as he pressed harder against John's back. "You think you can sit here, like you own this place?" Miller hissed. "You don't belong here." John froze. That was it. The unspoken truth between them. It wasn't about suspicion. It wasn't about a parking violation. It was about John's presence here, the color of his skin, the way it made Miller uncomfortable. "You don't belong here," Miller repeated, his voice venomous. John's jaw tightened. "I live here," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "I've lived here for years." But Miller wasn't listening. His grip tightened as he pushed John harder against the car, his frustration spilling over. "You always have an excuse." "Not today." John could feel the officer's anger. But beneath it, there was something else. Fear. Fear of being challenged, of being wrong. Fear of losing control. John's mind raced. He knew that nothing good could come from escalating this further. And yet, the officer's aggression was undeniable. Miller's fingers twitched near his gun like he was waiting for an excuse to escalate. The situation was getting worse with every passing second. In that moment, John made a choice. He wouldn't back down. He couldn't let this happen. Not again. Not without standing up for himself. He shifted his weight and slowly, deliberately, reached for the door handle. He stepped out of the car with the officer's hand still tight on his arm. And that's when it happened. Miller swung a fist, the blow landing squarely in John's stomach. The impact was sharp, unexpected. John staggered back, gasping for air. The force of the punch knocked the wind out of him, but more than the physical pain, it was the insult, the brutal assumption of guilt, that burned. What the hell was that for? John managed, his voice tight as he clutched his side. Miller took a step back, panting, his face flushed with rage. You were resisting, he muttered, though even he seemed unsure of his own words. The justification felt hollow, empty. The punch wasn't about resistance. It was about power. Control. Making John feel small. John straightened up, his breath ragged, trying to regain some sense of balance. That's when he saw it, something had fallen from his jacket pocket during the scuffle. It was a small, rectangular card, glinting in the fading sunlight. It was his military ID. John's stomach dropped as Miller's eyes darted to the ground. The officer bent down, picked up the card, and read it, his face draining of color. Major General John Carter. Miller stammered, his voice faltering. The words hung in the air between them like a slap to the face. For a moment, neither of them moved. John straightened, though the pain in his ribs still lingered. His eyes locked onto Miller's, cold and steady. That's right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And you just assaulted me for sitting in my car waiting for my wife. A crowd had started to gather around them, the murmurs growing louder as people pulled out their phones to capture what was happening. Some were recording, others were shouting, all of them watching the spectacle unfold with disbelief. Miller stood frozen, the weight of his mistake crashing down on him. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable as the crowd's murmurs turned into a chorus of voices, each one more incredulous than the last. John stood tall, despite the pain, his eyes never leaving the officer. You didn't ask, John said, his voice hard. You didn't give me the chance to explain. You assumed. And now you'll deal with the consequences. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Some were shouting at Miller, others were filming the entire scene, but it was the voice of a woman that cut through the chaos. Clear, sharp, authoritative. What's going on here? John turned slowly, wincing at the pain in his ribs, and saw Alyssa standing there. She was walking toward him, bags in hand, her face tight with concern. She locked eyes with Miller, her gaze hardening instantly. Is there a problem, officer? She asked, her voice cool but firm. Miller looked from John to Alyssa, confusion clouding his face. He couldn't seem to find his footing. The woman standing in front of him wasn't just John's wife. There was something in the way she held herself that made him uneasy. Alyssa's gaze never left Miller. Suspicious activity, she said, cutting him off. Is that what you call my husband sitting in a car, waiting for me? Miller stammered, his mouth opening and closing but unable to form a coherent sentence. The woman before him was unsettling, and now, it seemed, he was starting to realize just how deep this went. Then it hit him. Alyssa's face. He recognized her now. She wasn't just any woman. She was Alyssa Carter, the daughter of one of the state's most powerful senators. And this was no ordinary confrontation. This was personal. Give me your badge, officer, Alyssa said coldly, her voice unwavering. Before things get much worse for you. The world seemed to pause in that moment. The weight of Alyssa's words hit Jake Miller harder than any punch he could have thrown. For a moment, he stood frozen, his mind racing, the reality of his situation slowly sinking in. This wasn't just some routine traffic stop. This wasn't just about following protocol. He had made a choice, and now it was too late to take it back. The crowd was growing around them, phones raised, recording everything. Miller could feel the eyes on him, the judgment. He had crossed a line, and Alyssa's presence, her calm authority, was the last nail in the coffin. John was still standing tall, bruised and breathing heavily, his eyes never leaving the officer. Alyssa reached out and touched his arm, a silent gesture of reassurance. Her gaze, however, was fixed firmly on Miller, a quiet fury in her eyes. Miller's hand shook slightly as he fumbled for his badge, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You don't understand," he muttered, though the words were meaningless now. Alyssa didn't flinch. "I understand enough," she said, her voice steady. "What you've done here is unforgivable. You've humiliated my husband and put both of us in danger. I will make sure everyone knows what happened today." Jake handed over his badge, his fingers unwillingly loosening their grip on it. He knew, deep down, that his career was over. The department would have to investigate, and the public outcry would be impossible to ignore. But that wasn't what terrified him the most. What terrified him was the fact that he had crossed a line that could never be erased. He had let his own biases, his own anger, decide the course of action, and now, there would be consequences. Alyssa didn't take the badge right away. Instead, she stared at it for a long, uncomfortable moment, the silence hanging between them like a heavy curtain. The tension was thick, almost suffocating. "Do you think this is the first time this has happened?" she asked, her voice quieter now, but no less piercing. "Do you think you're the first cop to think a black man doesn't belong here, or anywhere, for that matter?" Miller's jaw clenched, his eyes darting to the ground. He had nothing to say. The truth, unspoken, was now too loud to ignore. Alyssa finally took the badge from his hand, holding it with a cold finality. "You're done here," she said. "And I'll make sure this goes public, every last detail. People need to know what happened. People need to know that this kind of injustice is happening on the streets they walk every day." She turned to the crowd, her eyes scanning the faces of the people who had been watching, recording, some offering their own quiet support. "This isn't just about us. This is about everyone who's been made to feel small, or unsafe, just because of the way they look," Alyssa continued, her voice growing louder. "We can't stay silent anymore." The crowd murmured in agreement, some of them beginning to speak up, adding their own stories, their own experiences. John watched, a mix of pride and exhaustion washing over him. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when the silence was broken. The officers who had been watching from a distance were now walking towards the scene, a sense of urgency in their step. Alyssa didn't flinch. She knew they were coming to protect their own, but she was ready for that too. Jake Miller stood to the side now, his head lowered, unable to look anyone in the eye. He had no excuses left. The truth was laid bare. The officer in charge approached Alyssa first. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, but his eyes flickering between her, John, and the visibly shaken Miller. Alyssa didn't hesitate. "No, it's not okay. Officer Miller here assaulted my husband without cause. He harassed him for sitting in his car, waiting for his wife. He escalated a simple situation into something dangerous. And now, we're all standing here while he tries to justify it." The officer seemed taken aback for a moment, then glanced at Miller, who looked like he was about to crumble under the weight of it all. "I didn't," Miller began, but Alyssa cut him off sharply. "No more lies. You were wrong, and you'll answer for it." The officer who had approached Alyssa glanced at his colleague, then at the people in the crowd, realizing that the situation was more complicated than he had anticipated. The cameras were still rolling, and now the story was not just about an officer losing control, it was about a system that allowed this to happen over and over again. "You're right," the officer said quietly, his voice a mix of regret and recognition. "We'll take it from here." Alyssa nodded once, satisfied. She handed Miller's badge to the officer, her expression unwavering. "I'll be in touch with the department and my lawyer. And don't think for a second that this will be swept under the rug." As the officers moved to escort Miller away, Alyssa turned to John, her hand slipping into his. "Let's go home," she said, her voice softening, but still firm with the weight of everything that had just happened. John looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude and admiration. He knew how hard this was for her, how much she had been through in her life. But now, more than ever, he realized just how strong she was. As they walked toward the car, the crowd began to disperse, the murmurs still echoing in the air. People had seen something today, something that would stick with them long after they went home. Something that reminded them that even in the darkest moments, there was power in speaking up. John opened the car door for Alyssa, the sting of the encounter still fresh in his mind, but his resolve even stronger now. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Alyssa smiled faintly, her eyes meeting his with understanding. "We're in this together," she said. "Always." They drove off into the fading light of the day, knowing that this battle was far from over. But they were ready. The next few days passed in a blur. The news of the altercation between Officer Miller and John, caught on camera by bystanders, quickly spread across social media, igniting a firestorm of discussion. Hashtags like #JusticeForJohn, #EndPoliceBrutality, and #NoJusticeNoPeace began trending nationwide, sparking protests and calls for accountability. Alyssa had been preparing for this, but even she couldn't have predicted the sheer volume of messages, demands, and media attention that flooded their lives. Interviews, demands for statements, and phone calls from activists, lawyers, and even politicians, everything was moving too fast. But she had promised John they would face it together. So she sat beside him through the chaos, organizing their thoughts, taking calls, speaking to journalists. They had a platform now, and it was up to them how they would use it. Despite the noise, despite the anger and hurt swirling around them, Alyssa was focused. She wasn't going to let this moment slip through their fingers. Not this time. One evening, after a long day of media briefings and statements, John sat down on the couch, rubbing his temples. The weight of everything was starting to hit him. He had become a symbol, something he never asked to be, and he wasn't sure how to carry it. "Are you okay?" Alyssa asked, sitting beside him and taking his hand. She had watched him over the past few days, seen how he was grappling with the newfound attention and pressure. John sighed. "I don't know. I'm just tired. Tired of it all. Tired of being treated like I'm less than. Tired of watching this happen to people who look like me and knowing I can't change it by myself. It feels like we're always fighting a battle we can't win." Alyssa squeezed his hand, her voice gentle but firm. "We're not alone in this fight. You're not alone. We're not just talking about one cop anymore, John. We're talking about a system. A system that needs to change. And the more people hear our story, the more we share the truth, the more we create that change." John looked up at her, his eyes searching for something, anything to hold on to. "But what if it's not enough? What if we do all this, and nothing changes? What if we're just voices in the wind?" Alyssa placed a hand on his cheek, gently turning his face toward her. "It's not about being perfect. It's not about making everyone see us. It's about standing up. It's about showing the people who feel the way you do that they're not invisible. And it's about making the people in power realize that we will not be silent anymore." John nodded slowly, taking in her words. It wasn't the first time she had spoken with such certainty, but hearing it now, in the midst of the storm, he could feel a small spark of hope kindling inside him. The following weeks were a whirlwind. They both spoke at rallies, John sharing his experience, Alyssa offering her support and a platform for others to speak out. The media attention was overwhelming, but it was necessary. They needed the world to see the truth of what had happened, not just the assault on John, but the deeper, systemic issues that perpetuated it. A few days after the incident, the department had announced an internal investigation into Officer Miller's actions. Alyssa and John knew this was just the beginning, and they weren't backing down. The public pressure was mounting, and the demands for justice grew louder with each passing day. But as the days turned into weeks, the scrutiny began to take its toll on them. They had moments of doubt, moments when the weight of the fight felt too heavy to carry. But in those moments, they had each other, and that made all the difference. One evening, they were sitting in their living room, watching a news broadcast about the growing protests in the city. Alyssa turned to John, her expression serious. "We've made a difference already," she said quietly. "But it's not enough. We can't stop now." John looked at her, a deep sense of exhaustion in his eyes. "What else can we do? We've done everything they asked us to. We spoke out. We shared our story. And yet, it's still happening. It's like we're shouting into the void." Alyssa shook her head. "We haven't just shared our story. We've given others the strength to share theirs, too. And that matters. Every voice counts. Every time someone speaks up, it chips away at the walls that protect the system. We may not see all the change right now, but that doesn't mean it's not happening." John nodded, still not completely convinced, but willing to trust her. Just then, the doorbell rang, and Alyssa stood up to answer it. When she opened the door, she found a young woman standing there, holding a stack of flyers. She looked nervous but determined. "Hi, I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said. I wanted to thank you. I wanted to thank you for what you're doing. My brother, he was in a situation like this last year. He was arrested for no reason, just walking home from work. He's still in jail. I've been trying to get people to pay attention, but it's hard. But when I saw you and John on TV, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. You gave me hope." Alyssa's heart swelled as she listened, and she motioned for the woman to come inside. "We're not alone," Alyssa said, her voice soft but strong. "And we're never going to stop fighting until there's real change." The woman smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you. I'm going to keep fighting for my brother. You've given me the strength to do it." Alyssa nodded. "We're all in this together." As the woman left, Alyssa closed the door and turned to John. The exhaustion in his eyes hadn't gone away, but the spark of determination was starting to return. "We're making a difference," she said quietly. John looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, we are." And in that moment, they knew they couldn't stop now. There was still so much to be done, but with every step, every story, every person they inspired to stand up, they were chipping away at the walls that had kept them silenced for so long. They were part of something bigger now, a movement that couldn't be ignored. And no matter how long it took, they would see it through to the end. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, they could see the possibility of change on the horizon. The months following the protests were a blur of legal battles, public scrutiny, and tireless organizing. The internal investigation into Officer Miller's actions was ongoing, but the more they learned about the system of protection that shielded him, the more the truth became undeniable. It wasn't just one officer, it was the entire structure that needed to change. John had grown increasingly frustrated. The delays, the red tape, the constant back and forth, it all felt like an attempt to wear them down. And to some extent, it worked. Every time they took a step forward, it seemed like the system took 2 steps back. But they couldn't stop now. They had to keep pushing, even when it felt impossible. One evening, as they sat in their small apartment, sifting through piles of paperwork and legal documents, Alyssa looked at John and saw the weight of the world in his eyes. He hadn't said much all day, and she could feel the quiet storm brewing inside him. "You've been quiet," she said, her voice gentle but probing. "What's on your mind?" John let out a long sigh, rubbing his temples. I don't know if I can keep doing this. Every day, it feels like we're running in place. We talk about justice, but all we get are excuses, delays, and more pain. I don't know how much more I can take." Alyssa placed a hand on his. "I get it. I really do. But we've come too far to give up now. We've already made a difference. Think about all the people who are finally speaking out, all the people who are sharing their stories because of what you did. This is bigger than us." John's eyes softened as he looked at her. "But how long until it's enough? How long until we see real change? I'm tired of feeling like a pawn in a game I can't control." Alyssa squeezed his hand, her expression unwavering. "Change isn't immediate. It's a process. It's messy. And it's exhausting. But it's happening. And the more we stand firm, the more we push back, the closer we get." Just then, a knock on the door interrupted their conversation. When Alyssa opened it, she found their lawyer, David, standing in the doorway. He was holding a thick file, and his face was grim. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside. John and Alyssa exchanged a look, both wondering what news he had brought. David sat down, placing the file on the table between them. "What's going on?" John asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and anxiety. David took a deep breath before speaking. "The investigation into Officer Miller is complicated. It's clear there's a cover-up happening at the highest levels. We've been pushing for transparency, but the department keeps stalling. We've had to file several motions just to get basic documents released. They don't want the truth getting out." Alyssa frowned. "What does that mean for us?" "It means we're up against more than just Officer Miller," David said, his tone serious. "We're up against an entire system that's been designed to protect officers like him. It's going to be a long fight, but I'm not giving up. We're taking this all the way to court if we have to." John rubbed his hands together nervously. "So, we're just stuck in this cycle of waiting?" "For now," David replied. "But the good news is, there's growing public pressure. People aren't backing down. Protests are getting bigger, more organized. You've started a movement, John. And now, we just have to keep pushing." John sat back, his mind racing. He could feel the anger rising again. It was hard to reconcile the man he wanted to be, the one who was fighting for justice, with the man he was becoming. He didn't want to be the face of a movement, didn't want to be the symbol of every injustice he had ever felt. But here he was, and the truth was undeniable. He had a platform now, and he couldn't walk away from it. He looked at Alyssa, who had been silently listening to the conversation. She gave him a small, encouraging smile, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know it's hard," she said, "but we're not doing this for us. We're doing it for everyone who feels invisible, who's been overlooked. We're doing it for your brother, for my cousins, for the people in this city who are waiting for change." John nodded slowly, taking in her words. He was exhausted, but she was right. They couldn't stop. They had to keep going. And just like that, the spark of hope he had almost lost flickered back to life. As the months went on, the pressure on the police department only increased. John and Alyssa continued to advocate for justice, attending rallies, speaking to the media, and raising awareness about police brutality and the urgent need for reform. The public outcry was impossible to ignore. But the system didn't change overnight. The trial against Officer Miller was slow-moving, bogged down by legal tactics and constant delays. And despite the mounting evidence against him, there was no guarantee that the justice they were fighting for would be served. Still, They pressed on, fueled by the voices of the people who stood with them. Every time they felt like giving up, they received messages from others who had been affected by the same issues, messages from families who had lost loved ones, from activists who were fighting their own battles, from people who needed to feel seen, heard, and supported. One evening, after another long day of speaking at a rally, Alyssa and John found themselves on the couch again, their exhaustion palpable. But there was a sense of calm between them now, a shared understanding that no matter how hard the road ahead might be, they were in it together. "I don't know where this will end up," John said quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But I do know one thing." "What's that?" Alyssa asked, her gaze soft. "I know that whatever happens, we've already changed something. We've already made a difference. And we're not going to stop until it's enough." Alyssa smiled, her heart full of pride. "We'll never stop." And for the first time in a long while, John believed it too. Months had passed, and the fight for justice had taken on a life of its own. The public's attention remained focused on the case, and with every new revelation, more people joined the movement. Protests had evolved from small, scattered demonstrations to organized, nationwide movements. People across the country were demanding accountability from law enforcement. And although it felt like progress, the weight of the fight still loomed heavy over John and Alyssa. The day they had been waiting for finally arrived, the trial of Officer Miller was set to begin. They knew the fight wasn't over yet, this was just the beginning of another battle in a long war, but it felt like the moment they had been working toward for so long. Everything had led to this. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The air was thick with anticipation as the prosecution presented its case. The defense, as expected, fought tooth and nail to discredit every piece of evidence. Officer Miller's attorneys painted him as a man simply doing his job, caught in an unfortunate situation, making split-second decisions. But John and Alyssa had seen the footage, they had heard the testimonies, and they knew the truth. John's heart pounded in his chest as he sat next to Alyssa in the courtroom, their lawyer, David, going over his notes. They had prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, the enormity of it all made his stomach twist. "I can't believe this is happening," Alyssa whispered, her hand gripping his tightly. "We're so close," John replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "But I can't shake the feeling that the system is going to fail us again." Alyssa looked at him, her expression full of determination. "We can't think like that. We've come this far. We just have to trust that the truth will come through." John nodded, though the doubt in his mind remained. He had been through too much to expect things to change just because the truth was on their side. It had been a long and grueling journey, one filled with disappointment, setbacks, and moments of overwhelming despair. But one thing was clear, he had to keep fighting, for himself, for the people who couldn't speak out, and for those who had already been silenced. As the trial unfolded, it became clear that the case was much more complicated than they had imagined. The defense was relentless, pulling every string they could to muddy the waters. The prosecution pushed back, but there were moments when even they seemed uncertain. There were inconsistencies in the evidence, hidden details in the police reports, and gaps in the timeline that the defense was quick to exploit. But then, something unexpected happened. A key witness, an officer who had been present the night of the incident, came forward with new information. This officer, who had initially been quiet, testified that Miller had acted outside the bounds of standard procedure. He had seen it all but had remained silent out of fear of retribution from his fellow officers. But the mounting pressure from the public and the growing awareness of systemic corruption had made him reconsider. The officer's testimony was powerful, shaking the very foundation of the defense's case. The courtroom was still as a pin could drop. John felt his pulse racing as he processed the words. It was a pivotal moment, the turning point they had been waiting for. Finally, it seemed like they had the upper hand. David, their lawyer, leaned in and whispered, "This could be it. The breakthrough we need." John looked at Alyssa, who was holding her breath, her eyes wide with disbelief. They had been waiting for a crack in the system, for a piece of truth to pierce through the layers of lies. And now, it seemed they had found it. The defense team tried to recover, but the damage had been done. The officer's testimony was hard to ignore, and the weight of it settled over the trial like a heavy cloak. The judge adjourned for the day, and as the courtroom emptied, the tension that had been hanging in the air finally began to ease. As they left the courthouse, John and Alyssa found themselves surrounded by supporters. News cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and people cheered, recognizing the significance of what had just happened. They had fought tirelessly to get to this point, and now, the tide was turning. "It's not over yet," John said, his voice strained with exhaustion. Alyssa nodded, wrapping her arm around him. "No, but we're closer than we've ever been." The following days were a blur of legal maneuvering, media attention, and a renewed sense of hope. John spent hours reading through documents, meeting with David, and preparing for the next phase of the trial. Alyssa continued to organize rallies, speaking to the press and sharing her story with anyone who would listen. The weight of it all was starting to take its toll on them. But in their quiet moments, when they were alone, they drew strength from each other. They had come so far together, and no matter what happened in the courtroom, they knew that their fight had already made a difference. As the final arguments were presented, it became clear that this trial had the potential to change everything. The case had captured the public's attention, and pressure was mounting on both sides. People were watching, and the world was waiting for justice. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. The minutes stretched into hours, and the anticipation was unbearable. John and Alyssa sat in the courtroom, their fingers intertwined, hearts pounding in their chests. Finally, the moment arrived. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The jury foreman stood up, holding the verdict in his hands. The tension was unbearable as he read the words that would change everything. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Miller, guilty of manslaughter." A wave of emotion washed over John. He could hardly believe it. For months, he had fought with everything he had, and now, it felt like the world had shifted. They had won. Justice had been served. Alyssa's eyes filled with tears, and she threw her arms around him. "We did it. We did it, John." He held her tight, feeling the weight of everything they had been through, all the sacrifices, all the struggles, finally pay off. But even as he felt a sense of relief, he knew that this victory was just one step in the long road to reform. There was still work to be done. But for now, they allowed themselves a moment of peace, knowing that the fight for justice had, for once, tipped in their favor. The days following Officer Miller's conviction were a whirlwind. News outlets carried the story of the landmark verdict, social media exploded with reactions, and people took to the streets, not only to celebrate but to remind the world that the fight for justice was far from over. The conviction of one officer was not the end of the systemic issues that plagued law enforcement. But for the first time in a long while, John and Alyssa felt a glimmer of hope. Though they had won the battle, the war was ongoing. The conversation about police brutality, racial injustice, and systemic inequality was only just beginning to take hold in the public conscience. The trial had ignited a fire, but the embers would need to be nurtured if real change was to take place. For John, the weeks after the trial felt like a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. He had spent years fighting, pushing, demanding accountability. And now that it was over, he felt an unfamiliar void. He couldn't rest yet, there was still so much work to be done. The fight that had consumed him for so long was no longer just about his brother. It was about the thousands of people who hadn't had the chance to see their day in court, the families who still lived in fear, the communities who had been failed by the very system that was supposed to protect them. Alyssa, too, struggled with the aftermath. She had spent months in the spotlight, advocating, rallying, speaking to anyone who would listen. But with the trial over, she felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility for what came next. She had always believed in the power of the people, in the collective strength of those who refused to stay silent. But as the media spotlight began to fade, she knew they needed more than just public attention. They needed real, lasting change. One evening, as they sat in their living room, the weight of it all seemed to press in on them both. John, staring out the window at the city lights, turned to Alyssa. "Do you ever think we've done enough?" he asked, his voice low. Alyssa shook her head, her hand resting on his. "No. Not by a long shot. But we've done something. We've shown people that change is possible. That justice can be served. And now, we keep pushing. We build on this. We make sure this doesn't just end with Miller's conviction." John looked at her, the fire still burning in her eyes. He could see the determination there, the same drive that had kept him going all these years. "You're right," he said softly. "We can't stop now. We need to keep going, for those who can't speak for themselves, for the ones who were forgotten." Alyssa squeezed his hand, her voice firm. "We keep fighting. We keep pushing. Until there's real change." The months that followed were filled with rallies, town halls, and meetings with lawmakers. John and Alyssa worked tirelessly to keep the momentum going. They traveled across the country, speaking at events, meeting with activists, and pushing for policy reform. They connected with families who had lost loved ones to police violence, sharing their stories and amplifying their voices. They formed coalitions with other organizations, and slowly but surely, they began to see the shift they had been working for. It wasn't easy. The road was filled with resistance, both from those who clung to the status quo and from the system that had been built to protect its own. But they refused to be deterred. With each new setback, they pushed harder. And with every small victory, whether it was a city passing new police accountability laws or a district attorney opening a new investigation into an old case, they saw that their efforts were not in vain. As the movement grew, so did the realization that this was a long-term battle. Reform would not happen overnight, and the fight for justice would require sustained effort, unwavering resolve, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. John stood at the front of a rally one afternoon, the crowd around him chanting, holding signs, and demanding justice. It was a sea of faces, black, white, Latino, Asian, indigenous, all united for a common cause. The energy was palpable, the sense of solidarity overwhelming. He had spent so many years fighting for justice, but in this moment, as he looked out at the crowd, he realized that the fight wasn't just his anymore. It was a movement. And they were all a part of it. "Look at this," he said, his voice carrying over the loudspeakers. "This is what happens when we come together. This is what happens when we refuse to stay silent. This is what happens when we demand that our voices be heard." The crowd erupted in applause, and John felt a surge of emotion, pride, hope, and a deep sense of purpose. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. They were all in this together, and together, they were unstoppable. One night, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings, John sat in his office, going over reports and making notes. He had made progress, but there was still so much to do. The phone on his desk buzzed. He glanced at the caller ID, it was Alyssa. "Hey," he answered, a tired smile on his face. "How's the rally planning going?" "Good, but I was just thinking," Alyssa began. "Maybe it's time we bring more people into the fold. We've been fighting this fight with the same group for so long, but I think it's time we go bigger. What if we bring in those who have been affected by the system the most, the incarcerated, those who've survived police brutality, and their families? What if we build an even larger coalition?" John leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "I like that. We've been building, but now it's time to expand. If we want real change, we have to include everyone who's been impacted. We can't leave anyone behind." Alyssa's voice softened. "Exactly. We have to show them that this isn't just a fight for us, it's a fight for everyone who's been hurt, everyone who's been overlooked." John felt the weight of the decision, but also a deep sense of purpose. They had already come so far, but now it was time to take the next step, to build a movement that wasn't just about one story, but about all the stories, all the lives that had been shattered by an unjust system. "Let's do it," John said, determination returning to his voice. "We'll expand. We'll bring everyone together. And this time, we won't stop until we win." Alyssa's laughter, light and hopeful, echoed through the phone. "That's the spirit, John. Together, we can do anything." And in that moment, John knew that the future, though uncertain, was one they could face together, united in their mission for justice. The road ahead was long, but it was one they were ready to travel. And with each step, they would change the world. As the months passed, the movement gained momentum. John and Alyssa's decision to expand the coalition had paid off. More voices joined their cause, representing communities that had long been silenced or ignored. The incarcerated, families of victims, activists, and even law enforcement officers who recognized the need for change came together. The energy was undeniable, and the movement was transforming into something far greater than anyone had anticipated. The demand for reform was spreading across the country, with rallies, protests, and sit-ins happening in cities from coast to coast. The message was clear: accountability, transparency, and justice for all. And John and Alyssa were at the heart of it, working tirelessly to ensure that the voices of the marginalized and the unheard were amplified. But it wasn't just about the marches or the public displays of solidarity. It was about policy. It was about making sure the voices of those who had been wronged were heard in the halls of government, in the offices of district attorneys, and within the very institutions that had failed them. For John, it became less about personal healing and more about shaping a future where no one else had to endure the pain his family had. Alyssa, with her tireless optimism and sharp mind, had become a powerful force in the political arena. She had always believed in the power of the people, but now she saw firsthand how crucial it was to not just challenge the system, but to work from within it. She was invited to speak at legislative hearings, pushing for bills that demanded more transparency in policing, better accountability measures for officers, and reform in the criminal justice system. But the deeper they dug, the more they realized how much resistance they would face. The system was built to protect itself, and the pushback came in many forms: legal challenges, smear campaigns, and even threats of violence. The movement was labeled by some as radical, even dangerous. But John and Alyssa refused to be discouraged. One evening, while they were preparing for another large rally, Alyssa called John to her office. She had been working on a new initiative that she believed could bring the movement to the next level. "I think we need to create a new platform, something that reaches people who are still on the fence, who don't see this as their fight," Alyssa said, her voice filled with excitement. "We need to show them that this is about everyone. That police reform isn't just about protecting communities of color, it's about protecting every single person, about ensuring everyone's rights are respected." John, looking over her notes, nodded slowly. "So, you're thinking of a message that resonates with more than just the usual crowd?" "Exactly," Alyssa replied. "We need to broaden our scope, appeal to those who think this is a black and white issue and show them that the system affects everyone. Everyone deserves to feel safe in their communities, no matter their background or skin color. We need to create a new narrative. We need to remind people of the values that should be at the heart of every community: justice, fairness, and equality." John leaned forward, energized by the idea. "Let's do it. We can frame this in a way that connects to everyone: parents, teachers, workers. We're all in this together." The next few weeks were a blur of planning and strategizing. They held focus groups, bringing in people from all walks of life: those who had been victims of police violence, those who had worked in law enforcement, everyday citizens who wanted to see change. Together, they crafted a new message, one that was about unity, fairness, and a future that valued every life equally. John and Alyssa took the message on the road, traveling to smaller cities and rural communities where people were less familiar with the movement. They spoke at churches, town halls, and schools, sharing their personal stories but also giving space to others to speak. They called it the Voices of Change Tour, and it quickly gained traction. At first, some of the crowds were skeptical. They were used to hearing about the problem in urban areas, but the issues of police brutality and systemic injustice felt distant to them. But as John and Alyssa shared their message and opened the floor to dialogue, something shifted. The crowd grew more engaged, more connected to the cause. They began to see that police violence wasn't just an urban issue, it was a systemic issue that had rippled through every facet of society. One night, in a small town in the Midwest, a young woman approached Alyssa after the event. She had tears in her eyes as she spoke. "I never understood why this was such a big deal before," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I've never been personally affected by police violence, but hearing your story, hearing all these stories. I see it now. I see how it affects everyone." Alyssa, holding her hand, smiled softly. "This isn't about the few, it's about the many. It's about creating a system where everyone can feel safe, where justice doesn't depend on who you are or where you come from. It's about making sure we all have a fair shot at life." The woman nodded, wiping her eyes. "I'm with you. I want to help. I don't know how yet, but I want to do something." And just like that, the movement had expanded even further. What started as a fight for one man's brother had now become a nationwide movement for justice, equality, and reform. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the pressure was mounting. Legislators, pushed by the growing strength of the movement, began to take action. Bills were being debated, committees were being formed, and the conversations that had once been ignored were now impossible to avoid. However, not everyone was willing to embrace change. Powerful lobbies from law enforcement unions and political groups that had long defended the status quo pushed back fiercely. But John and Alyssa knew they had the people behind them. And with every new rally, every new speech, and every new story shared, they gained more and more momentum. The calls for action were louder than ever, and they were just getting started. Their work was far from finished. The path to reform was still fraught with challenges, and victory was not guaranteed. But in this moment, with every new face joining the fight, with every new voice rising in unity, they knew they were part of something historic. They had ignited a fire. And that fire would not be extinguished until true change was achieved. The movement was now an unstoppable force, and yet, the challenges they faced were as intense as ever. As John and Alyssa stood before packed crowds in various cities, they felt the weight of responsibility pressing on them. The messages they spread were powerful, but the battle for change wasn't just about shifting public opinion, it was about confronting the deep-rooted systems that had perpetuated injustice for generations. John had grown used to being in the spotlight, but the toll it took was undeniable. In the midst of public rallies and meetings with legislators, he found himself reflecting more on his own past, on the loss of his brother and the pain that had fueled this fight. It was still hard for him to fully confront his grief, but each speech, each story shared, seemed to bring him closer to understanding what his brother's death had truly meant. It was about justice, yes, but it was also about healing for his community, for his country, and ultimately, for himself. Alyssa, on the other hand, thrived in the whirlwind of political strategy and activism. She had never been afraid of hard work or opposition. But she could feel the pressure too, especially when personal attacks started to target her. Some critics accused her of being too radical, of trying to dismantle the system altogether. But Alyssa didn't back down. She understood that sometimes, to create lasting change, the system itself had to be reformed, not just its outer structures. It wasn't just about making noise anymore, it was about making a real difference. And that meant they needed allies in every corner of society. They needed not only activists, but also people in positions of power who understood that reform was necessary. And with every new city they visited, more politicians, business leaders, and community organizers began to take notice. One evening, after a particularly emotional rally in a city where the local police force had faced accusations of corruption, Alyssa met with a group of state senators. The discussions were tense, with some expressing deep skepticism about the movement's demands. "You're asking for changes that could fundamentally alter the way law enforcement operates in this state," Senator Harold Langford said, his voice skeptical. "You're asking for oversight that could erode trust between the community and the police." Alyssa leaned forward. "What we're asking for is accountability. Transparency. Trust isn't something that should be assumed, it has to be earned. And right now, too many communities are living in fear of the people who are supposed to protect them. We're asking for a future where that isn't the case." Langford scoffed, but another senator, Senator Diane Harris, spoke up. "I've seen the numbers, Harold. The data is undeniable. We can't keep ignoring the fact that certain communities are disproportionately impacted by violence. We need to listen to what people like John and Alyssa are saying. And we need to act." The conversation shifted, slowly, but it was clear that the tide was turning. Alyssa had always known that change came through relentless persistence, and that night, she felt a small but significant shift in the room. They weren't there yet, but they were closer. Back at their headquarters, John sat with his brother's photo in front of him. He hadn't been able to let go of the vision of Isaac's face, his life snuffed out too soon. Isaac had always been the one with the dream of making things better. And now, John had inherited that dream. It was more than a personal battle, it was a collective one. But every new victory felt bittersweet. The fight for justice was his tribute to his brother's memory, and with every success, he knew Isaac would have been proud. He looked up at Alyssa, who was busy working through emails and text messages on her phone. They were both exhausted, but they could see the light at the end of the tunnel. The nation was starting to change, and they were at the forefront of that change. "Alyssa, you know this isn't going to be easy," John said, his voice somber but determined. "But I think we're really starting to make an impact." Alyssa looked up, her tired eyes reflecting the fire that had carried her this far. "We are. And we can't stop now. There's too much at stake. We've come too far to turn back. This is bigger than us, bigger than our personal pain, it's for everyone who's ever felt unheard or unsafe." John nodded, the weight of their shared mission settling heavily on his shoulders. He could feel the fear of what was still to come, but it was overshadowed by the certainty of one thing: they were doing the right thing. The next few weeks were filled with critical moments. The movement's platform had expanded to include calls for police reform, but also for economic justice, better healthcare, and improved educational systems in underserved communities. They had learned early on that true change couldn't be piecemeal. To build a truly fair and just society, they needed to tackle the systemic issues in every sector. But there were still moments of deep despair. The opposition was fierce, and some of their strongest allies began to buckle under pressure. Public opinion wavered as the media started to scrutinize the movement's every action, looking for flaws, contradictions, or any reason to discredit their cause. And then came the devastating blow. One of the key pieces of legislation, an oversight bill that would have held police departments more accountable for misconduct, was blocked by a powerful coalition of law enforcement unions. The news hit like a hammer, and the movement was thrown into chaos. "We can't let this defeat us," Alyssa said, pacing in their campaign office the night after the vote. "This is just one setback. We've been knocked down before." John stood at the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. His heart was heavy, but he knew Alyssa was right. This wasn't the end. They had come too far to give up now. "I don't know how much longer we can keep pushing," John murmured, his voice filled with the exhaustion of a long battle. "But I do know one thing: we can't stop. We can't let this die." And so, they pressed on. It was in the face of defeat that their resolve grew stronger. The battle for justice, for true equality, would not be won in a single day, but they would never stop fighting. Together, they would find a way to turn this setback into the fuel they needed to continue pushing for a future where everyone could truly feel safe, heard, and valued. Despite the recent setback with the blocked legislation, the movement didn't lose momentum. Instead, it ignited a renewed sense of urgency. The protesters in the streets grew more determined. Social media campaigns picked up speed, spreading their message far and wide. Celebrities, activists, and ordinary citizens rallied behind their cause. The coalition that had once seemed fragmented was now stronger, more unified than ever before. John and Alyssa found themselves navigating this increasingly complex landscape. They were becoming symbols of hope, but the pressure to succeed was crushing at times. Every public appearance, every rally, every speech carried the weight of countless expectations. But there was also a growing realization: they were no longer just activists. They were leaders in a movement that was fundamentally changing the political and social landscape. One morning, as they sat in their office, preparing for a major press conference, a knock interrupted their conversation. It was Elijah, one of their trusted allies from the grassroots community organizers, who had been with them since the beginning. "We've got a problem," Elijah said, looking tense. "There's been a leak. Someone in the movement is feeding information to the opposition. And it's not just any info, there are rumors that there's an undercover investigation happening against you both. Someone's trying to discredit everything we've worked for." John's eyes narrowed, a flash of anger crossing his face. "Who's behind it?" Elijah shook his head. "We're still trying to trace it. But this could be bad. They've been digging into your past, Alyssa, your family connections, your history with some of the other activists involved. They'll try to turn it against us." Alyssa exhaled sharply. She'd known it would come to this. They had been too loud, too unapologetic in their demands for justice. And now, the establishment was coming for them. It wasn't just political opposition, it was a full-scale attempt to dismantle their credibility. "I'll deal with it," Alyssa said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Let's get ahead of this. If they think they can scare us, they're wrong." John, though angry, was calm. "We can't let this distract us. We've got work to do. We're not backing down. If they want to attack us, they'll have to deal with the people who stand with us." The next few days were a blur of strategy meetings, phone calls, and public statements. Alyssa had an innate ability to remain composed in the face of chaos, and John followed her lead. Together, they fought back against the attempts to smear their names. They issued a public statement, challenging the accusations head-on, and began investigating the source of the leak. But it was clear that the stakes were higher than ever before. Every day seemed to bring a new obstacle. Reports came in of politicians who had once supported the cause now wavering in the face of growing pressure. The media had turned on them, and the constant rumors about their leadership's integrity were beginning to take a toll. As they walked into a major fundraising event, the weight of their position became clear. The ballroom was full of well-dressed donors, politicians, and philanthropists, all of whom had promised their support months ago. But as John surveyed the room, he couldn't help but feel the tension in the air. He had learned to read people well, and tonight, many of these faces didn't seem as certain as they once were. Alyssa noticed his unease. "Don't worry about them," she whispered, giving him a reassuring smile. "They're with us. They just need to see that we're not afraid." But as the night wore on, John couldn't shake the feeling that the ground was shifting beneath them. Even those who had pledged their support were now questioning the path forward. In the quiet moments between speeches and socializing, he overheard whispers about the leaks, the rumors, and the pressure mounting from all sides. Later that evening, as they sat in their car heading back to their hotel, John turned to Alyssa. "This might be the hardest part yet, isn't it?" Alyssa stared out the window, her eyes darkened by the weight of their shared journey. "It's always the hardest part when the truth is on the line. But this fight isn't just ours. It's everyone who has ever been told their voice doesn't matter. We can't let them win. Her words, though simple, carried the gravity of everything they had been through. They were right at the edge now. The next phase of their movement would define everything. The following week brought new developments. One of the key allies who had stood with them from the beginning, an influential civil rights attorney named Thomas Hayes, publicly announced his withdrawal from the movement. His departure sent shockwaves through the political and activist community, and soon after, more leaders followed suit, either distancing themselves from John and Alyssa or stepping down from their positions entirely. The media had a field day, painting the movement as fractured, with John and Alyssa portrayed as divisive figures. The blowback was swift, but Alyssa wasn't ready to give in. She knew this was a test, not just of their movement, but of their resolve. And she wouldn't let anyone think they were done. "We'll rebuild. We'll regroup," Alyssa said, as they gathered their remaining allies in their headquarters. "We've lost some, but we still have so many who believe in this cause. We're not finished yet." But even as they picked up the pieces, John couldn't help but wonder how much more they could endure. He had always known the fight for justice would come with sacrifices, but the toll it was taking on him, on all of them, was becoming harder to ignore. The scars were deeper than they had imagined. And yet, with every defeat, there was a flicker of something that kept him going, a spark of hope that refused to die. They had come too far, fought too hard, to stop now. Together, they would continue the fight, no matter the cost. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear, they would never back down. The days following Thomas Hayes' public departure were a blur. The media was relentless, focusing on the fractures within the movement. Headlines like, "The Collapse of a Dream" and "Movement at Risk of Falling Apart" dominated the news cycle. It seemed as though every time John and Alyssa took a step forward, a new challenge knocked them 2 steps back. But amidst the chaos, the support from their grassroots base remained strong. People who had joined their cause early on, those who didn't have the political connections or wealth to influence the media, continued to rally. They showed up at protests, attended town halls, and wrote letters to lawmakers, demanding that their voices be heard. One evening, as Alyssa was reviewing the latest batch of donation reports, she looked up to see John standing in the doorway, his face marked by fatigue but also determination. "They're trying to divide us," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "They want us to think it's over. But we can't let them win." Alyssa stood, walking over to him. "I know. But it's not just about us anymore. We have to focus on what we started this for. The people who are still standing with us, the ones who need this change the most, they're counting on us." John nodded slowly. He had always been the one to see the big picture, the one to understand that their fight wasn't just for them but for future generations. But even he could feel the weight of the sacrifices piling up. "I spoke to some of the others earlier," Alyssa continued. "We're planning another rally, bigger than anything we've done before. We need to remind everyone what we're fighting for." John agreed. It was time to make a stand. They needed to rally the people who believed in justice, equality, and change, not just the ones who had the most influence. The fight wasn't over, in fact, it was just beginning. The rally was set to take place in Washington, D.C. The location, on the steps of the Capitol, was symbolic. It would send a message not just to lawmakers but to the entire nation. The people, once again, were taking their power into their own hands. The days leading up to the event were filled with speeches, meetings, and strategy sessions. Alyssa and John worked tirelessly to coordinate the logistics, while their team engaged with community leaders and influencers to ensure the rally was well attended. But as the day of the rally approached, they knew it wouldn't be enough just to show up. They needed to bring the message home. The morning of the rally, the air was electric with anticipation. Tens of thousands of people flooded the National Mall, their voices united in a single demand for justice. Families, students, workers, activists, all marched together with a common purpose. The streets were filled with chants, songs, and slogans, a testament to the movement's enduring power. When John and Alyssa arrived, they were met with cheers, but it wasn't just the size of the crowd that struck them. It was the diversity, the people who had joined the cause from all walks of life, each one adding their own voice to the collective roar for change. As they stood at the podium, John could feel the weight of the moment. The cameras were on them, but it wasn't the media that mattered now. It was the people. It was the faces in the crowd, the ones that reflected the very heart of the movement. Alyssa stepped forward first, her voice strong and unwavering as she spoke to the crowd. Today, we stand together as a symbol of resistance, a symbol of hope. We are the ones who will not be silenced, who will not be ignored. We will fight for every person who has ever been told they don't matter, who has been overlooked, who has been oppressed. We will not stop until every voice is heard, every injustice is addressed. The crowd erupted into applause, but Alyssa held up a hand to quiet them. But we need more than just noise. We need action. We need to demand from our leaders what is rightfully ours, equal rights, justice, and the opportunity to live with dignity. We will not let them tear us apart. We are stronger than they think. John stepped up beside her, his words cutting through the silence that followed. This movement is not just about changing laws. It's about changing hearts. It's about rebuilding a system that has never worked for the people it was meant to serve. We will not rest until we've made it clear that this country belongs to all of us, equally. The crowd roared in response, and for a moment, John felt a surge of energy he hadn't felt in weeks. This was the spark they needed, the people were ready to fight with them. But as the rally drew to a close, the reality of their situation set back in. While the media coverage was largely positive, the political opposition was already mobilizing. They had managed to turn the tide in some key districts, and new challenges were emerging from unexpected quarters. The pressure on the movement had never been greater. Back at their headquarters, after the rally, the team gathered for a strategy session. Elijah, still a key ally, had been working on outreach efforts, while the communications team had been crafting new messages for social media. But even with all their efforts, the underlying issues remained. "We've got a new wave of resistance to deal with," Elijah said, looking over his notes. "And this time, it's coming from all sides, inside and outside the movement. There are whispers that some of our own are being wooed by corporate interests, by people who want to co-opt what we've built. They're offering money, power, influence." Alyssa clenched her fists. "It's always the same," she muttered. "The powerful think they can buy us. But they don't get it. This is bigger than money. This is about people's lives." John, who had been quiet for a moment, finally spoke up. "We can't let ourselves get distracted. We need to keep the focus on what matters. We've got to build coalitions with the people who will stand by us, no matter the cost." Alyssa looked around at the group. "We've been through hell. We've seen our movement tested in ways most people couldn't imagine. But we've made it this far because we never gave up. We're not about to let anything break us now." The room fell silent as her words settled in. It was clear, no matter the challenges ahead, they were ready to face them head-on. Together, they would push forward. The road to justice would not be easy, but it was one they would walk, step by determined step, until the world changed. And they would make sure it did. As weeks turned into months, the pressure of maintaining the momentum began to wear on everyone. Despite their victories, despite the thousands still marching in the streets, there was a palpable sense of unease in the movement. Politicians continued to shift the narrative, news outlets offered competing interpretations of every event, and, worst of all, infighting was beginning to surface among the leadership. Alyssa felt it most acutely. Each new headline, each new debate seemed to distract from the heart of their message. She and John had been through so much, but as the stakes grew higher, it felt as though they were losing control of the story they had worked so hard to tell. John, however, remained laser-focused on the work. He had always been able to separate the noise from the mission, but even he couldn't ignore the fact that there was a growing division within the movement. One evening, after a long series of meetings and phone calls, Alyssa stood at the window of their office, staring out at the skyline. The city felt both familiar and distant to her, like it was watching, waiting for something, but unsure of what. She could almost feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. John walked up beside her, his tired eyes betraying the exhaustion he'd been pushing through. "We're at a crossroads," he said, his voice low. "And we both know it." Alyssa nodded. "The movement's fractured. People are questioning where we go next, and I don't know how to get everyone on the same page. Some are pushing us to go further, faster. Others want to slow down, get more strategic. The media's calling for us to make decisions, but it feels like the more we do, the more we lose." John sighed. "The truth is, it's never been about getting everyone on the same page. It's about getting enough people to believe in what we're doing. If we let the infighting distract us, we'll lose that support." Alyssa turned to him, her eyes hard with resolve. "Then we fight for the people who've been with us since the beginning. We remind them what this is all for. We can't let the system pull us apart." John nodded slowly. He knew what she meant. They had to go back to their roots, the people in the streets, the ones whose lives had been forever changed by the injustices they were fighting against. It wasn't about appeasing the elites or securing political endorsements. It was about the everyday people who had taken a stand and made this movement what it was. The next day, they held a rally in the heart of a working-class neighborhood, one that had been hit hardest by the systemic issues they were fighting. The crowd wasn't as large as the ones in D.C., but it was deeply passionate. There were no frills, no major media outlets broadcasting it live. It was a direct conversation between the movement's leaders and the people they were fighting for. Alyssa took the stage first, looking out over the crowd. She saw faces, so many faces, each one filled with hope, anger, and a deep yearning for change. This was the reason they fought. This was where it all began. This fight isn't about big corporations. It's not about politicians who've already made their fortunes. It's about you. It's about the mothers who have to work 2 jobs just to feed their kids. It's about the fathers who are forced to watch their sons and daughters face an unfair justice system. It's about the communities that have been ignored for far too long, she said, her voice strong and unwavering. The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time in weeks, Alyssa felt something shift inside her. The people were still with them. They hadn't lost them yet. John stepped forward, his tone deliberate and steady. "The system has been built to divide us. To make us believe that we don't have power. But look at us here today. This is power. When we stand together, we are unstoppable. We've come too far to let fear take hold now. The fight isn't over. It's just beginning." The crowd cheered, and Alyssa could see that the energy was different this time. There was a renewed sense of purpose in the air. They were reminded of why they had come this far. But just as they began to feel the weight of their progress, a new challenge appeared. Elijah, who had been their ally through thick and thin, called an emergency meeting. When Alyssa and John arrived at the conference room, Elijah was already there, his face grave. "We've got a problem," Elijah began, sliding a stack of papers across the table. "There's a new bill in Congress, an anti-protest law. If it passes, it could make everything we've done, everything we're trying to do, illegal." Alyssa felt a cold knot form in her stomach. How could they even get this far? "They've been pushing it under the radar for months," Elijah said. "It's a direct response to the protests, to the pressure the movement has been putting on the government. They're trying to silence us." John clenched his fists. "We can't let this happen." Alyssa stood up, pacing. "We have to expose this. We have to show the people what's at stake. This isn't just a law, it's a threat to everything we've built. We're not going to let them take away our right to speak out. As the meeting progressed, the gravity of the situation became clear. The bill wasn't just an obstacle, it was a direct attack on the movement's core principles: the right to protest, the right to free speech, and the right to demand justice. "Time is running out," Elijah said. "We have to act fast if we want to stop this." Alyssa nodded, her resolve firming up. "Then we fight. We've fought for too long to let something like this stop us." John turned to her, determination in his eyes. "This is it. The moment we've been waiting for. We're going to show them who we really are." It wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about sending a message, that no matter how many obstacles were thrown in their path, they would never stop fighting. Not now. Not ever. And they would make sure that everyone, every single person, knew the stakes. The movement was about to reach its tipping point. The fight against the anti-protest bill was a battle unlike any they had faced before. Alyssa, John, and Elijah knew that this was the moment where the movement could either collapse under pressure or rise to unprecedented heights. The law was a direct attempt to dismantle everything they had worked for, a government trying to silence the voices that had been speaking out for justice, for equality, for change. Alyssa threw herself into the fight with all the energy she had left. It wasn't just about speeches anymore or rallies, it was about fighting a legal battle that could shape the future of the movement. The media, sensing a turning point, began covering the law more extensively. There were protests in every major city, but the government's response was swift and brutal. Police in riot gear clashed with crowds that only grew more determined with each passing day. The pressure weighed heavily on everyone. Every strategy, every speech, every protest carried the weight of history. The message was clear: this law wasn't just about restricting protest, it was about quashing a revolution in its tracks. Elijah was in constant contact with legal teams, ensuring that the movement was prepared for every possible challenge. He was more focused than ever, but there was an unmistakable fatigue in his voice whenever they spoke. John, always the strategist, kept looking for ways to move forward, ways to push back without giving up ground. But for Alyssa, it felt like everything they'd built was hanging by a thread. Then, just as tensions reached a boiling point, a surprise came from the most unexpected source: a former ally, turned rival, named Marcus. He had been one of the early leaders in the movement, an advocate for radical change who had grown increasingly disillusioned with the pace of progress. He had once been Alyssa's biggest supporter, but now, he had become a vocal critic. Marcus called an emergency press conference. The last time his name appeared in the headlines, it was to denounce the movement for not going far enough. This time, though, he was presenting something that would shock the nation: a massive coalition of grassroots organizations, unions, and community groups who had pledged to fight the anti-protest law with everything they had. "What they're doing to us, to our voices, is more than just a legal issue, it's an attack on our democracy," Marcus declared, standing behind a podium emblazoned with the logo of his new organization, the People's Coalition. "We won't let them take our rights without a fight." Alyssa felt a surge of mixed emotions watching him speak on the news. He had been right about one thing: the movement needed to unite, to stand together in this fight. But at the same time, Marcus' sudden shift felt like betrayal. He had left them behind, abandoned everything they'd built in favor of an alternative vision that no longer aligned with what they stood for. John, seeing Alyssa's frustration, put a hand on her shoulder. "We can't focus on what's divided us. This is a sign of something bigger. It means we have power. We've forced the system to react." Alyssa turned to him, her voice tight with emotion. "But it doesn't feel right. Not like this. We've been fighting for one thing: unity, collective action. And now it's all splintering." "We have to move forward," John replied, his tone resolute. "Marcus may not share our vision anymore, but the coalition he's formed is a powerful force. We need to reach out, form alliances where we can, and get everyone to stand together." This is no longer just about us. It's about a movement that's too big to be stopped. Alyssa knew he was right. There was no room for division anymore. If they were going to win, they had to show the world that they were more than just a few leaders, they were a force made up of millions, united in their pursuit of justice. Days later, as they prepared for a national march on Capitol Hill, Alyssa and John stood before the movement's supporters. The turnout was overwhelming, stretching as far as the eye could see. It wasn't just people from their own cities anymore, it was a national movement, a powerful symbol of the people coming together to fight for their rights. "We're here because we refuse to be silenced," Alyssa told the crowd, her voice echoing through the speakers. "They want to divide us, scare us, and take away our right to protest. But they're forgetting one thing, this movement is bigger than any law they could pass. It's bigger than any government. It's about the people." The crowd erupted in cheers, and for the first time in weeks, Alyssa felt an overwhelming sense of unity. There was no more time for doubt, no more time for hesitation. They had reached a tipping point, and they were ready to fight with everything they had. The march that followed was nothing short of historic. Thousands upon thousands of people took to the streets, all chanting in unison, their voices rising in a chorus that could not be ignored. The Capitol stood in the distance, but the protesters were undeterred. They had made it clear that this fight was far from over. The government had underestimated the power of a united people. As they advanced toward Capitol Hill, every step they took seemed to echo in the halls of power. This wasn't just a protest, it was a movement, a call to action that demanded attention. And the message was clear, the people would not be silenced. As Alyssa and John watched the march unfold, they both knew the next steps would be crucial. This was the tipping point, but it was also a crossroads. The fight was far from over, and the government's response was imminent. Would they listen, or would they tighten their grip, only to ignite an even larger fire? The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Alyssa felt hopeful. She knew they couldn't afford to back down. They had come too far, and the people were behind them. Together, they would press on, no matter the cost. And the movement would continue. The week after the massive march on Capitol Hill, the air was thick with anticipation. The media coverage had been relentless, and the public's eyes were now fixed on the government's next move. Alyssa, John, and the rest of the movement's leadership knew that the pressure had only just begun. The government, however, had not been idle. In response to the demonstrations, they tightened their rhetoric and began to implement stricter measures. The anti-protest law, despite being challenged in court, was moving quickly through the legislative process. It was clear that the administration was determined to push it through, and they weren't going to back down. But there was something the government had underestimated, the power of the people. The movement had evolved beyond the borders of any one city or state. It had become a tidal wave, crashing through barriers and sweeping through communities. Alyssa and her team were working tirelessly behind the scenes. They had formed alliances with activists, organizers, and leaders from across the country. The goal was clear: stop the law before it could be fully enacted. But to do that, they would need to find a way to appeal to the hearts and minds of the people who hadn't yet joined the fight. Alyssa sat down with John, Elijah, and a few others in a small conference room that smelled of stale coffee and old paper. They'd been brainstorming for days about their next move, trying to figure out how to counter the government's increasingly harsh tactics. "We need to show the world the real cost of this law," Alyssa said, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the papers in front of her. "We need to make them understand that this is more than just about protest. This is about the very fabric of our democracy." John nodded, leaning forward. "We have to expose the personal toll this is taking. The violence, the surveillance, the intimidation tactics. People are scared, scared to speak out, scared to organize. But if we show them that we're standing up, if we demonstrate that we won't be silenced, it'll force their hand." Elijah, ever the voice of reason, spoke next. "We also need to be smart. We can't make this just about emotion, we need strategy. Every protest needs to be calculated, every march planned. We need to be one step ahead. Alyssa sighed, rubbing her eyes. I know. It's just, it feels like we're running out of time. The courts are slow, the politicians are bought, and the police are getting more aggressive by the day. How much longer can we keep this up? We don't have the luxury of time, John said firmly. But we've got something they don't, the people. If we can keep the momentum going, if we can unite enough communities, this law won't stand a chance. Alyssa felt a surge of determination rise within her. It was true, they had the power of the people behind them, and that was a force no law could contain. The next day, the movement launched a new campaign, Our Voices, Our Rights. It was a call to action that went viral within hours. They posted videos of everyday people, from teachers and students to parents and workers, speaking out about the importance of protest and the dangers of silencing dissent. The message was simple: if the government could take away the right to protest, it could take away any right. Across social media, stories began pouring in from all corners of the country. The movement's message spread like wildfire, fueled by a surge of grassroots support. People who had been hesitant to join now found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers, united in their shared belief that this fight was bigger than any one person. Alyssa stood on the steps of the Capitol with John and Elijah, watching as more and more people arrived to join the rally. It was a sight she had hoped for, but now that it was happening, she could hardly believe it. "We're doing it," John said, his voice filled with awe. "They're listening." Alyssa nodded. "But we can't stop. This has to be the beginning, not the end." As the rally kicked off, speakers from every background, every race, every age, took the stage, each telling their own story of why this fight mattered. The crowd cheered, their voices echoing in a powerful chorus that rang out across the city. Alyssa's heart swelled with pride as she listened to the crowd chant in unison, "Our voices, our rights. Our voices, our rights." But even as she basked in the energy of the crowd, a small voice of doubt lingered in her mind. This wasn't over yet. The government was still pushing forward with the law, and they were only getting more desperate to suppress the movement. She knew that they would have to dig deeper, push harder, and face even greater opposition. That night, as Alyssa sat alone in her office, she received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was low, cautious. "It's time to escalate," the caller said. "We have the power now. It's time to use it." Alyssa's stomach tightened. "Who is this?" "I'm someone who can help," the voice responded. "But you need to make a choice. We can take this to the next level, but it's going to get ugly. Are you ready for that?" Alyssa's mind raced. She had always believed in nonviolent resistance, in the power of peaceful protest. But now, with everything on the line, was it time to consider a more radical approach? She hesitated, then spoke with quiet determination. "What do you suggest?" The voice on the other end paused before responding. "I'm talking about civil disobedience, direct action. We'll take over key institutions, stop the system in its tracks. But we need your leadership. Will you stand with us?" Alyssa looked out the window at the Capitol, its silhouette dark against the sky. This was the moment of truth. They were at a crossroads, and the choices they made now would define the future of the movement. "I'm in," Alyssa said, her voice steady. "But we do this the right way. We do it together." The line went silent for a moment before the voice responded. "We've got your back." The next phase of the movement had begun, and there was no turning back now. The days that followed were a blur of planning, strategizing, and rallying the people. Alyssa had made the choice to move forward with direct action, and the responsibility weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had always preached peace, unity, and nonviolent resistance, but the stakes had changed. The government was digging its heels in, and every peaceful protest seemed to be met with more aggression, more surveillance, and more attempts to silence them. She had heard the argument, this isn't just about protesting anymore. This is about survival. It was a sentiment that had resonated with her, but it didn't make the decision any easier. With the new strategy in place, the movement began to organize a series of non-violent but disruptive actions that would challenge the core functions of government and the economy. They targeted symbolic locations, the halls of power, the offices of major corporations, transportation hubs, and media outlets. The goal wasn't just to disrupt, but to force the government to acknowledge their demands. On the morning of the first planned action, the atmosphere was thick with a sense of urgency. Alyssa, John, and Elijah sat in a small war room, an abandoned office space they'd converted into a command center. Their phones buzzed with updates from their ground teams, each reporting in with last-minute details. The operation would unfold in stages, each one carefully coordinated to avoid bloodshed and to maintain the moral high ground. "We're ready," John said, checking his watch. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of excitement behind his words. "It's all set." Alyssa nodded, her mind racing through every potential risk. "We've made it this far. We can't afford any mistakes. Don't worry. We've got this," Elijah added, his calm demeanor always grounding them. "The people are ready." The clock ticked closer to the hour, and the team split off to their respective locations. Alyssa's role was simple but crucial, to be the face of the movement, to speak directly to the world. If this was going to work, they needed the media to pay attention. The first action took place at the steps of the Supreme Court. A group of activists had gathered in the early morning, holding signs that read, "We are the people. We are the voice." They had locked arms, prepared to sit in for as long as it took. As the clock struck 9 a.m., the first wave of protesters took their seats. Alyssa stood off to the side, watching as the peaceful sit-in began. The media, already tipped off, was swarming. News helicopters hovered overhead, capturing the scene from every angle. The activists sat, unwavering, as security personnel approached, attempting to move them. But they were prepared. They knew the law enforcement would push, and they had the support of lawyers ready to challenge any attempt to forcibly remove them. Alyssa took a deep breath, knowing that this was only the beginning. As the day wore on, similar actions unfolded in cities across the country. In Chicago, a large group of teachers and students took to the streets outside City Hall, staging a symbolic "sick out." Thousands of workers in New York shut down major transit hubs, calling attention to the oppressive nature of the new law. And in Los Angeles, a massive sit-in halted traffic on the freeways, one of the busiest in the country. The coordinated actions were nothing short of breathtaking. The government's response was swift. They attempted to arrest key figures, seize protest materials, and even cut off social media platforms in an attempt to stifle communication. But it was too late. The message had spread far and wide, igniting a firestorm of solidarity. Alyssa, standing in front of the Capitol later that evening, looked at the thousands of people gathered before her. Their faces were full of hope, but also exhaustion. They had been through so much already, and now they were facing an even tougher battle. "We've made a statement today," Alyssa said, speaking into a loudspeaker. "But this fight is far from over. The government may try to silence us. They may try to imprison us. But we will not back down. We will not be intimidated. Our voices will be heard." The crowd erupted into cheers, the sound reverberating across the steps of the Capitol. Alyssa's heart swelled with pride, but she couldn't shake the sense of impending danger. As the protesters sang and chanted, the government had already begun retaliating, mobilizing law enforcement, and passing emergency measures. The stage was set for a full-blown confrontation. By the time the sun set, the media was ablaze with coverage. Protesters were being arrested, and reports of clashes between law enforcement and demonstrators were flooding news outlets. But there was one piece of news that stood out among the rest. Government pushes through anti-protest law amid nationwide protests. The bill had passed. Alyssa's heart sank as she read the headline on her phone. The government had acted fast, pushing the law through Congress with overwhelming support. The movement had failed in stopping it, at least for now. "We knew this was coming," John said, joining her as she stared at the screen. "They're going to make us the enemy. But we can't stop now." Alyssa exhaled sharply, staring at the bill in her hand. The weight of failure hung heavily on her shoulders. But then, as she looked out at the sea of people still gathered outside, she knew what had to come next. "Now we fight harder," she said. "We take this to the courts, to the streets, to the world. We show them we won't back down. We make them understand that this is not just about laws, but about the future of our country." She looked around at her team, their faces determined, ready for whatever would come next. The struggle has just begun. The fight was far from over. Now, more than ever, the movement had to be vigilant. It wasn't just about protest anymore. It was about survival, about freedom, and about standing together against forces that sought to divide them. In the weeks that followed, the country would face an even more intense struggle. Alyssa knew that they would have to prepare for the next phase. The battle had been taken to the highest levels of government, but the people, the power of the people, were ready to meet it head-on. The weeks following the passage of the anti-protest law were filled with uncertainty, fear, and tension. The government's crackdown on dissent had escalated. People who had once been ordinary citizens were now targeted for their participation in peaceful protests. Alyssa, John, and Elijah had anticipated this response, but the reality of it still sent shockwaves through the movement. While some activists chose to flee to the underground networks of sanctuary cities, others were determined to stay and fight, even at the risk of arrest. Alyssa had become the face of the resistance, a symbol of courage and resilience. But even she could feel the walls closing in. Everywhere they turned, the movement's actions were met with heightened surveillance and increasingly violent tactics from law enforcement. People were getting arrested in the middle of the night. Protest leaders were disappearing. Social media accounts were being shut down, and phones were tapped. Yet, despite it all, the resistance only grew stronger. It was late one evening when Alyssa received an encrypted message. It was from an anonymous source within the government. "Get ready. We have intel on the next move. They're preparing a national mobilization of military forces to quell any uprisings. They're targeting major cities. Be vigilant." Alyssa's hand shook as she read the message. She had known this was coming, escalation was inevitable. The question now was how to respond. Her team gathered in the war room, poring over the intel and brainstorming strategies. "They're not just coming after us with arrests anymore. They're preparing to use force," Elijah said, his voice grim. "If they deploy military units in major cities, it's going to be an all-out war." John looked at the map of the country on the wall. "We need to make sure we're ready. We can't just react to what they do, we need to be proactive. If they're coming for us, we need to disrupt their plans before they even have a chance to execute them." The tension was palpable as the team began formulating plans. They knew it wasn't enough to just protest anymore. It was time to escalate their efforts, but with caution. They needed to strike at the heart of the government's operations, cripple their infrastructure, and force them to negotiate. Alyssa found herself in an internal struggle. She was no longer the hopeful leader she had once been, the one who dreamed of peaceful protests and social change through unity. Now, she was becoming the strategist, the one who had to make difficult choices, the one who had to consider how far they were willing to go. "There's no going back now, is there?" she whispered to John one evening as they sat alone in the war room. He had always been her rock, the person who kept her grounded when things felt overwhelming. "No," John replied, his face somber. "There's no turning back. But we're not alone in this. We have the people. We have the will of the masses behind us. That's what makes us strong. The first major confrontation came 2 weeks later. The government's military forces began their mobilization, sending units to key locations in the most active protest cities. The streets were flooded with armed soldiers, and curfews were enforced nationwide. Alyssa watched the news with a sense of dread as reports of violent clashes flooded in. The resistance had been anticipating this move, and they were ready. In the dead of night, her team mobilized, sending activists to key transportation hubs, energy plants, and government buildings. The goal was not to engage directly with the military, but to disrupt their operations and create enough chaos to prevent them from carrying out their plans. Alyssa stood at the front lines of the largest disruption in Washington, D.C. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the weight of responsibility felt heavier than ever. Thousands of protesters were gathered outside the Pentagon, blocking entryways and setting up barricades. "This is it," Elijah said, his voice quiet as he adjusted his earpiece. "We'll have a short window before they start coming in with full force. We have to move quickly." Alyssa nodded, her mind focused. The plan was risky, distracting the military enough to buy time for other activists to disable key infrastructure points, but it was their best chance to stop the escalation. As the first soldiers began arriving, the protesters stood firm. Tensions mounted, and the sound of sirens filled the air. Alyssa's breath caught in her throat when the first wave of military trucks rolled down the street. She could see the cold determination in the soldiers' eyes. They were prepared to fight. But the people were ready too. A loud bang echoed through the street. It was a signal. Protesters surged forward, pushing back against the soldiers, while others moved to disrupt the power grid and shut down communication lines. The military wasn't prepared for this kind of coordinated resistance. For a brief moment, Alyssa felt a rush of hope. They were taking control of the narrative, defying the government's attempt to crush them. But that hope was quickly replaced with a deep sense of fear when the second wave of military personnel arrived, heavily armed, prepared to shoot to kill. "Move back!" Elijah shouted, pulling Alyssa out of the line of fire. But it was too late. The soldiers had begun to advance. The situation had escalated beyond anything they had anticipated. The protesters held their ground, but as the military moved in, clashes became inevitable. Alyssa knew that, at this moment, they were no longer fighting just for their rights. They were fighting for their very survival. The hours that followed were chaotic. Protesters and soldiers clashed in the streets of Washington, D.C., and across the country. The government had declared martial law, and cities were plunged into chaos. Despite the violence, Alyssa refused to back down. The people had made it clear, they were not afraid. In the days that followed, the country was divided like never before. There were those who stood with the resistance, and those who stood with the government. The conflict had ignited a civil unrest that seemed unstoppable. Alyssa watched the television one night, hearing about the damage, the lives lost, and the devastation. She could see the toll it was taking on the people, the same people who had once been hopeful, who had believed that they could change the system. But there was something else in her heart, too. It was a small flicker of defiance that refused to be extinguished. The struggle was far from over. Days blurred into weeks as the nation continued to fracture. The military's presence in major cities was undeniable. Armored vehicles patrolled the streets, soldiers stood watch at intersections, and curfews were strictly enforced. The government had declared martial law, a heavy-handed response that pushed the country to the brink of civil war. Alyssa had spent the last few days in constant motion, meeting with underground resistance leaders, organizing operations, and trying to stay ahead of the military's movements. Her body was exhausted, but her resolve was stronger than ever. She knew the fight was far from over, but she also knew that this war, this battle for freedom, would define the future. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Elijah. "We have a new lead. Someone inside the government wants to talk. They say they have information that could change everything." Alyssa stared at the message for a moment, uncertainty washing over her. The thought of a government insider reaching out felt almost too good to be true. Could it be a trap? Was it another attempt to mislead the resistance, to draw them into a false sense of hope? Get a location. I'll be there, she replied, despite her reservations. 2 hours later, Alyssa met Elijah in an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. The place smelled of mildew and decay, but it had become one of their safe houses over the past few months. Elijah was already there, his face grim as he stood near the door. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly, his voice tense. "This could be another government ploy to get us in the open. If we're not careful." "I know," Alyssa interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "But we can't afford to let opportunities slip by. We need intel. If this person has what we think they have, it could change the course of everything." Elijah nodded, though his skepticism remained. He had always been the cautious one, the one who measured every risk before taking action. And Alyssa respected that, she needed his level-headedness, especially now. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. The man was tall, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap that obscured most of his face. His eyes darted around the room, scanning for any sign of danger before he took a hesitant step forward. "You're Alyssa?" he asked in a low voice, his tone almost fearful. She nodded, her guard still up. "Who are you?" "My name is Jared," the man replied, his hands trembling slightly. I'm with the government. I've been working in the intel division for years. I want to help. I have information that could end this, if you'll listen." Alyssa studied him for a moment, her instincts telling her to be wary. But there was something in his eyes, something that told her he wasn't lying. "What kind of information?" she asked. Jared hesitated before speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's a plan in place to escalate this war, more than just the military. The government has been making secret deals with private contractors to bring in mercenaries, people who are above the law, trained to kill without question. They're preparing to wipe out entire sections of the resistance." Alyssa's blood ran cold. The stakes were higher than she had imagined. "I can give you their locations, their codes, the timing of their operations," Jared continued. "But you have to act fast. The government is closing in on me. If I stay here too long, I'll be exposed." He handed her a small, encrypted flash drive. "Everything you need is on here. I've already transmitted it to a secure channel, but it's only available for a short time." Alyssa took the drive, her fingers brushing his. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, still unsure of his true motives. Jared swallowed hard. "Because I can't stand what they're doing anymore. The killing, the lies. I thought I could ignore it, but I can't. I can't be a part of this any longer. I want to make things right." There was a long silence, and for the first time in weeks, Alyssa felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. It was fragile, but it was there. "Thank you," she said softly. "You've done the right thing." Before Jared could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder outside. Alyssa's heart leapt into her throat. "We don't have much time," Elijah said, already moving toward the exit. "We need to go. Now." Alyssa nodded and turned to Jared. "Stay low. Don't trust anyone. We'll get you out of here." Jared's face hardened, but there was a look of determination in his eyes. "I'll be fine. Just promise me you'll use the information. Don't let it be for nothing." With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as he had come. The team worked quickly, scanning the data Jared had provided. The information was staggering, detailed plans for mercenary movements, government operations, and specific targets within the resistance. But it wasn't just the locations that terrified them, it was the scale of what was coming. The government wasn't just prepared for civil unrest anymore. They were preparing for war. Alyssa felt the weight of the situation press down on her as she stared at the screen. If they acted now, they might be able to stop the worst of it. But doing so would come with its own set of risks, escalating the conflict even further, perhaps even guaranteeing more deaths. "We don't have a choice," John said, his voice steady but resolute. "We have to move. This is our only shot." Elijah nodded in agreement. "The longer we wait, the worse it will get. We need to disrupt their operations before they can deploy the mercenaries." Alyssa took a deep breath, her eyes focused on the map in front of her. There was no turning back. They had crossed a line, and now, they had to see it through. "Let's do it," she said, her voice hardening with resolve. "For the people. For the future." In the coming days, the resistance launched a series of coordinated strikes, disrupting military supply lines, sabotaging communication hubs, and targeting key government officials. The mercenaries, who had been prepared to crush the resistance, found themselves caught in the middle of a fight they hadn't anticipated, a fight for survival. Alyssa knew this was just the beginning. The government would retaliate. The violence would escalate. But as long as the resistance had the will to fight, they would not back down. And neither would she. The days that followed their strategic attacks felt like a constant battle of wits. As the resistance disrupted the government's plans, the military's response grew increasingly ruthless. They began conducting sweeps in the cities, rounding up suspected insurgents and anyone who had aided the resistance. The city streets, once full of life, now seemed haunted by fear and uncertainty. Alyssa had expected the retaliation, but nothing could prepare her for the scope of it. The government had unleashed their full might, tanks patrolled the roads, drones hovered above, and soldiers no longer cared about subtlety. The city was a war zone, a place where the faintest stirrings of rebellion could cost someone their life. But it wasn't just the military they had to worry about. The mercenaries were everywhere, heavily armed, efficient, and without mercy. They were shadow figures, moving in the dark, with only one mission: eliminate the resistance. In the midst of it all, Alyssa and her team took refuge in a dilapidated apartment building, its concrete walls battered by the violence outside. The weight of their situation pressed down on them. The losses had begun to mount, each strike against the government met with a reprisal that decimated their numbers. Elijah's expression was hard, his face gaunt from the constant stress. He hadn't slept properly in days. Every mission, every ambush, every piece of intel they gathered seemed to come at a greater cost. "We can't keep doing this," he said one evening, his voice low and strained as he stood near the window, peering through the cracked glass. "The government is too strong, the mercenaries too well trained. We're losing more people every day. How much longer can we hold out?" Alyssa knew what he was asking. He wasn't just talking about the mission, or the next fight. He was asking if it was worth it, if all the bloodshed, all the sacrifice, was leading them anywhere at all. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice tight with the truth of it. "But I do know this: if we give up now, everything we've fought for, everything we've lost, will have been for nothing. We can't let them win." Alyssa's words were unwavering, but inside, she too was beginning to question how much more they could endure. Each day felt like a step closer to the edge of something irreversible. Just as the team began to gather for their next operation, an unexpected visitor arrived at their hideout. Jared. He had reappeared, just as quickly as he had vanished. His eyes were wide with panic, his clothes torn and bloodied, as though he had barely escaped an ambush. "I've got bad news," he said, breathless. "They're moving faster than we thought. The mercenaries, there's a full-scale operation coming your way. They're targeting the heart of the resistance. If you stay here, you'll be wiped out." Alyssa's pulse quickened. They had no time to waste. "Where's the strike happening?" she asked, already reaching for her gear. Jared handed her another encrypted drive. "I managed to get the plans. They're planning an assault on the safe houses. They know where we are, and they'll be here by morning. You need to move now. The room fell into tense silence as everyone processed the information. The safe houses had been their refuge, their lifeline, and now they were compromised. We've been playing their game for too long, John said, his voice sharp. We need to take the fight to them. We can't wait for them to come to us. Alyssa nodded. It's time. We hit them hard. No more hiding. Hours later, they had gathered every available fighter from their network. The strike would be swift, calculated, and direct. The target, the mercenaries' headquarters, a fortified facility that housed both government officers and private contractors. It was a high-risk mission, but the stakes had never been higher. Alyssa stood at the front of the group, her face set with determination. Elijah, John, and the others were beside her, ready to move out. They had no idea how many mercenaries they would face or if they would survive the operation. But there was no turning back. As they approached the facility, Alyssa's mind raced with the gravity of their actions. This was no longer just a fight for survival, it was a fight for justice. They couldn't let the government continue its reign of terror. If they were going to die, they would die on their own terms, taking as many of the enemy down with them as they could. The team moved swiftly and quietly, infiltrating the compound under the cover of darkness. The sounds of gunfire and explosions echoed through the air as they engaged in close-quarter combat with the mercenaries. Each strike was precise, calculated, but the resistance was outnumbered and outgunned. Jared's intel had been invaluable, but even with the element of surprise, they were taking heavy losses. One by one, fighters fell. The relentless tide of mercenaries didn't stop. But neither did Alyssa and her team. They fought with everything they had, their resolve hardening with each new threat. As the night wore on, the tide began to turn. The resistance had made it past the outer perimeter and reached the heart of the compound. They breached the control room, where they found the real source of the government's power, the Operations Command Center, filled with files, records, and classified data. Alyssa stood over the command console, her fingers trembling as she accessed the files. What she saw took her breath away. The government had been planning more than just this war. They had been laying the groundwork for a totalitarian regime, one that would crush any form of dissent. They weren't just fighting the resistance. They were preparing to reshape the entire world. This is it, she muttered, her voice a mixture of fury and disbelief. This is what we're up against. John, still fighting beside her, glanced at the screen. We need to make sure the world sees this. They'll never stop unless we expose everything. Alyssa nodded, but before they could finish their mission, the sound of reinforcements flooded the compound. The resistance had accomplished what they came for, but they were quickly surrounded. There was no way out. Only one choice remained. Get the data out, Alyssa ordered, her voice low but firm. Get it to the world. Now. And in that moment, the resistance's future rested in the hands of those who dared to expose the truth. The explosion that rocked the compound felt like the end. The sound of gunfire and shouting filled the air as the resistance fighters made their final stand. Alyssa had no illusions left. There was no escape, no heroic exit. But they had succeeded in one thing, they had exposed the government's true intentions to the world. The data was in the hands of the few who could carry it forward, and that was the only thing that mattered now. Alyssa and her team fought their way to the exit, but the mercenaries had them cornered. The command center was compromised, the evidence of the government's far-reaching plot now out in the open. It was a victory, but it felt hollow as the walls closed in around them. Elijah was the first to fall. A sharp scream cut through the chaos as a mercenary's bullet struck him. He crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide with shock. Alyssa reached him in a heartbeat, but she knew there was no saving him. "Stay with me, Elijah," she shouted, her voice cracking. But it was useless. Elijah's hand went limp in hers, his body already cooling. The world felt as though it was slipping away, but she forced herself to focus. Elijah had fought so hard for this cause. She couldn't let his death be in vain. "John, we need to move," she cried, urgency bleeding into her voice. John, covered in blood, his face streaked with dirt, nodded. He was barely standing, but the fire in his eyes was unyielding. They couldn't stop now. Not with the truth in their hands. With a final surge of energy, they moved towards the exit, cutting down enemies as they went. They made it to the outer wall of the compound, their breaths ragged, their bodies battered. But the enemy wasn't far behind. More mercenaries swarmed toward them, guns raised, ready to end the resistance for good. Alyssa glanced over at John, who had barely kept up with her. His leg was bleeding from a deep wound, and it was clear that he was near the breaking point. She could feel the weight of their lost comrades and the toll this mission had taken on all of them. "This is it," John said, his voice strained. "I don't think we make it out of this one." Alyssa's heart clenched, but she refused to give up hope. "Not yet." "Don't say that. We're not done yet," she snapped, though she knew the odds were slim. The data they had retrieved could change the course of history, but getting it out alive was becoming less and less likely. Before they could make another move, Jared reappeared from the shadows. His clothes were torn, his face grim, but he had the glint of determination in his eyes. He had survived longer than anyone thought possible, and now, he was there to give them their last shot. "I've got an extraction point," Jared said, his voice low but firm. "We can't stay here. Follow me." Alyssa didn't hesitate. She nodded, and they began to run, ignoring the pain and exhaustion that threatened to slow them down. Jared led them through hidden paths, dodging patrols, and avoiding the main roads where mercenaries were combing the area. It was a dangerous game, but it was their only chance. As they neared the extraction point, Alyssa allowed herself a brief moment of hope. Maybe they could still make it. Maybe they could escape and expose everything they had risked their lives for. But that hope was shattered as the sound of helicopters filled the air. "Get down!" Jared barked. They ducked into a nearby alleyway, pressing their bodies against the cold concrete. The helicopters hovered above, searching the streets with spotlights, the hum of the engines deafening. "They're looking for us," Alyssa murmured, her voice tight with fear. "We have to keep moving." Jared gave a curt nod and motioned for them to follow him. But as they reached the final stretch toward the extraction point, disaster struck. A mercenary unit ambushed them from behind, cutting off their path. Alyssa froze as she saw the enemy close in. They were trapped. "We can't fight our way out of this," John said through gritted teeth, his face pale with pain. "We'll never make it." Alyssa looked at him, and then at Jared, who was already setting up a diversion. He had a plan. "I'll hold them off," Jared said. "Get to the extraction point. I'll be right behind you." Alyssa shook her head, panic rising in her chest. "No, Jared. You can't." "I'll be fine," he interrupted. "Get the data out. Don't let them destroy everything we've worked for." With no other choice, Alyssa and John pushed forward, running as fast as they could. The sound of gunfire erupted behind them, and they could hear Jared's voice shouting commands, trying to buy them more time. They reached the extraction point just as a helicopter touched down, a figure stepping out to greet them. It was a man Alyssa had never seen before, but the insignia on his uniform told her everything she needed to know. He was from the underground network, the very people who had funded their mission, who had been watching from the shadows. "Are you Alyssa?" the man asked, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "I am," she replied breathlessly. "Where's Jared?" "He didn't make it," the man said, his eyes hardening. "But we got the data. That's what matters." Alyssa's heart sank. Jared had given his life for this mission. She felt the weight of his sacrifice press down on her, but she knew it had to be done. They couldn't afford to lose everything now. As the helicopter lifted off, Alyssa looked down at the city below, the lights flickering in the distance. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. But with the truth now in the hands of those who could expose it, she had hope for the first time in what felt like years. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun.